This story is titled, My Aunt Stole My Fiancé for Her Daughter. Now everyone's crying after I took the trust fund. Hey everyone! The channel's been slowing down a bit, and I spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world, and helps keep this journey going strong. Let's grow together! Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, I'm 28 years old, and up until last year, I thought I had my life perfectly figured out. I was engaged to Nate, 27, the man I thought was the love of my life. We met in college, but back then, we were just acquaintances. He was charming and funny, but we didn't hang out in the same circles. After graduation, we reconnected at a mutual friend's party, and that's when everything changed. We clicked almost instantly and started dating not long after. For 4 years, we built what I thought was a solid relationship. He proposed to me after a weekend trip to the mountains, and I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. Our engagement was a big deal. We had a small ceremony to celebrate, with close friends and family. My aunt and cousin Mia were invited, though honestly, I only included them out of obligation. My aunt and I have never been close. She's the kind of person who always finds ways to put others down to make herself and her daughter look better. Mia is 4 years younger than me, and admittedly very pretty, but she's also about as intelligent as a brick. My aunt, though, has always acted like Mia is the golden child, constantly comparing us in ridiculous ways. Once, she actually compared Mia's 8th grade report card to my 12th grade one and declared Mia better academically because her grades were marginally better than mine in middle school. The fact that I graduated high school with honors and went on to college apparently didn't matter. Despite our rocky relationship, I didn't think much about my aunt or Mia attending the engagement. They were family, after all, and Nate seemed to charm everyone there, including my aunt. She wouldn't stop gushing over him, saying things like, "Oh, he's so handsome, and look at how successful he is. You really hit the jackpot, didn't you?" At the time, I thought she was just being her usual over-the-top self, but looking back now, I see that it wasn't just admiration. It was something else entirely. Fast forward a few months, and Nate and I were planning our wedding for October. I had to leave for a summer program in the UK, but everything was set to go. We'd picked a venue, started working on a guest list, and even put down deposits on some of the vendors. Nate seemed supportive of my trip, though looking back, I wonder if he was just pretending. While I was abroad, we stayed in touch through calls and texts, but after the first couple of weeks, something shifted. He started making excuses for why he couldn't talk. Things like being swamped with work or just too tired. I assumed the distance was taking a toll, but I figured we could get through it. After all, we weren't a new couple. We had years of trust and love behind us. At least that's what I thought. About a month into my trip, our conversations became shorter and less frequent. I asked him if everything was okay, and he brushed it off, saying he was just stressed. Then, a week before my program ended, he completely stopped responding. I called, texted, and even emailed him, but there was no reply. At first, I was worried. Maybe something had happened at work, or he was dealing with some personal issue he wasn't ready to talk about. But as the days went by, I started to feel like something was seriously wrong. Still, I told myself we'd work it out when I got home. When I returned, I went straight to my apartment, hoping to find a message from him. Instead, I found my aunt waiting at my door. She handed me a printed wedding invitation, yes, an actual printed invitation, in the age of emails, and told me that Nate was marrying Mia. At first, I thought it was some kind of twisted joke. I even laughed nervously and asked her what she was talking about. But her smug expression told me she wasn't kidding. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. "I know this must be hard for you, but you have to understand. When people fall out of love, it's no one's fault." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Nate and I had been planning a wedding just weeks ago, and now he was marrying my cousin? It didn't make any sense. My aunt must have noticed my confusion because she quickly filled in the gaps. She explained in excruciating detail how Nate had been lonely while I was away and had turned to Mia for comfort. She made it sound like some romantic fairy tale, describing how Nate had confessed his love for Mia over coffee and proposed to her like an old-school gentleman. Her words felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then came the insults, disguised as concern. "You can't blame Mia, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You know how beautiful she is. It's not her fault Nate fell for her. Maybe you should have thought twice before going to the UK. Long distance can be so hard on a relationship." She even had the audacity to suggest that I should be happy for them, saying, "At least he'll still be part of the family." I was too stunned to respond. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her to get out of my sight, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, tears streaming down my face as she continued her cruel monologue. Finally, I managed to tell her to leave, though my voice was shaky and weak. She smirked, patted my shoulder like I was some pitiful child, and said, "Don't be discouraged, dear. I'm sure you'll find someone else. Maybe an older, divorced man who's looking for a second chance at love." After she left, I collapsed on my couch and cried harder than I ever had in my life. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and completely shattered. Nate, the man I had loved and trusted, had not only cheated on me but had done so with my own cousin. And my aunt, who had always looked down on me, had taken delight in rubbing it in my face. I didn't know how I was going to move forward, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay in this city, surrounded by people who would forever remind me of what I'd lost. After that humiliating visit from my aunt, I spent the next few days in a haze. I barely ate, slept, or did anything other than replay the whole situation in my head. How could this have happened? Nate had given me no real explanation, no closure, just silence. I had thought we were building a life together, but apparently he had been planning a life with someone else. And not just anyone, but Mia, my cousin, the one person my aunt had always pitted against me. For a while, I couldn't even face my friends or coworkers. I didn't want to deal with the questions or the pitying looks. Everyone had known about our engagement. How could they not? We'd had a big engagement party, complete with photos on social media and gushy posts about how lucky we were to have found each other. Now all I could think about was how stupid I must have looked. My mom, bless her, came to stay with me for a week when she found out what had happened. She's always been my rock, and having her there made things a little easier. She didn't push me to talk about it, but she was there when I needed her. We spent hours watching bad TV, eating ice cream straight from the tub, and trying to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. She even joked, "Well, at least you dodged a bullet. If he could do this to you, imagine what kind of husband he'd have been." It helped, but the moment she left, the loneliness hit me all over again. Everywhere I went, there were memories of Nate. The coffee shop we used to visit on Saturday mornings, the park where he had proposed, even the kitchen table where we'd spent countless nights planning our future together. It was suffocating. I knew I couldn't stay in the city any longer. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far away from all the reminders of what I'd lost. I started applying for jobs abroad, something I had thought about doing before Nate came into my life. Within a few weeks, I landed a promising position in Leeds, UK. It wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to rebuild my life from the ground up. I packed up my apartment, said goodbye to my mom, and boarded a plane with a mix of fear and hope. Moving to a new city, let alone a new country, was terrifying at first. I didn't know anyone, and for the first few weeks, I felt completely out of place. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to find my footing. My co-workers were welcoming, and the work kept me busy. I threw myself into my new job, staying late and volunteering for extra projects just to keep my mind occupied. Slowly but surely, the ache in my chest began to fade. One day, a few months after I had settled in, I got a call from my mom that changed everything. She sounded almost giddy as she told me about a recent family gathering. Apparently, my aunt had been bragging about Nate and Mia's upcoming wedding, going on and on about how perfect they were together. But then, someone asked what Nate did for a living. My mom, knowing full well that Nate had quit his job to pursue his passion for writing, decided to stay quiet and let my aunt handle the question. My aunt, thinking Nate was still employed, confidently told everyone he was working in finance. Well, it didn't take long for someone to spill the beans. Another relative chimed in, saying, "Oh, I thought he quit his job last year. Isn't he trying to become a writer now?" My mom said my aunt's face turned beet red as she stammered through an excuse about how writing is such a noble profession. But the damage was done. My aunt realized she had married Mia off to someone who didn't even have a stable income. I couldn't stop laughing as my mom recounted the story. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. My aunt, who had always looked down on me, had been so blinded by Nate's charm that she didn't even bother to look beneath the surface. Now she was stuck with a son-in-law who couldn't pay the bills, and Mia, who had never worked a day in her life, had to take a part-time job as a receptionist just to keep them afloat. Hearing this was like a balm for my wounded pride. I had spent so long feeling like the loser in this situation, but now I could see that I was better off without Nate. Sure, I had lost someone I loved, but what had they gained? A broke writer and a life built on lies. But the best part? My mom told me that Nate and I still had a joint trust fund. Back when we were engaged, we had started saving for our future together. I was the one who managed our finances, so I had full access to it. After everything that happened, I had completely forgotten about it. Now it felt like a gift. I wasted no time liquidating the account, transferring the money to my own savings. Sure, 20% of it technically belonged to Nate, but after everything I had spent supporting him, covering his rent, his groceries, even his creative expenses when he quit his job, I figured it was more than fair. I knew Nate would eventually come looking for the money. He was too arrogant to think I'd actually do something like that. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had taken back control. I wasn't the victim anymore. If Nate and Mia wanted to build a life together, they could do it without me, or my money. For months, I settled into my new life in Leeds, working hard and focusing on myself. I hadn't thought much about Nate or my family back home, at least not until Christmas rolled around. That's when the drama found its way back to me. It started with Nate showing up at my mom's house. I wasn't home for the holidays. I had decided to spend Christmas in Leeds and keep my distance. But that didn't stop him. According to my mom, he knocked on her door looking for me and demanded to talk about the trust fund. My mom wasn't sure what he was talking about until he started ranting about how I had stolen his money. She quickly shut him down, saying, if my daughter took anything, she had every right to. But Nate wasn't having it. He kept insisting that the trust fund was our money and that I was obligated to give him his share. When my mom told me about this later, I could practically hear her rolling her eyes over the phone. I wasn't surprised that Nate had come sniffing around. He had always been good at playing the victim, and this was just another example of him trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. What did surprise me was how bold he was. Did he really think he could cheat on me, marry my cousin, and then come back asking for money like nothing had happened? A few days after Christmas, Nate decided to email me directly. His tone was desperate, almost pathetic. He claimed he was on the verge of being evicted and needed the trust fund money to pay off his overdue rent. He even had the audacity to say that I was being petty by withholding the money. You don't understand how hard things have been for me and Mia, he wrote, as if I was supposed to care about their struggles after what they had done to me. I ignored the email, but Nate, being Nate, didn't stop there. He sent another email a few days later, this time trying a different tactic. He apologized for how things had ended between us and admitted he had made mistakes. He said he regretted hurting me and hoped we could find a way to move past it. But of course, the real purpose of the email was clear. He wanted the money. He even tried to guilt me by saying, I thought you would be more understanding considering everything we shared. It was laughable. Understanding? After he humiliated me and destroyed our relationship? Not a chance. Still, I decided to reply. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to make one thing clear. I told him that the trust fund was gone and that he had no right to it. Consider it repayment for all the money I spent supporting you while you were busy chasing your dreams, I wrote. Then I blocked him. But of course, it didn't end there. A few weeks later, my aunt and Mia showed up at my mom's house, demanding to speak to me. Apparently, Nate had told them about the trust fund, and now they were all up in arms over the fact that I had liquidated it. My mom called me after they left, barely able to contain her laughter. Your aunt was furious, she said. She actually had the nerve to say you ruined Nate's life. According to my mom, Mia was in tears, saying that I had sabotaged their future. She claimed they were on the verge of homelessness and begged my mom to convince me to give Nate his share of the money. My mom, being the amazing woman she is, told them to leave and never come back. If Mia is so successful, as your aunt keeps claiming, then why can't she support her husband? She asked them. But the real kicker came when my dad got involved. He doesn't usually get mixed up in family drama, but this time he had had enough. When he heard about what my aunt and Mia had said, he called them out. He told my aunt that if she didn't stop harassing me, he would cut off the financial support he had been giving her for years. He even pointed out that if Mia and Nate were struggling so much, maybe they should have thought twice before betraying me. My aunt, of course, tried to play the victim. She started crying, saying she had only wanted to secure Mia's future and hadn't realized Nate was a bum. Apparently, she had assumed Nate was still working in finance and was horrified to learn that he had quit his job over a year ago to pursue writing. She actually had the gall to blame me for not telling her the truth about Nate's financial situation. If I had known, I would never have let Mia marry him, she wailed. The irony of the whole situation was almost too much to handle. My aunt had spent years tearing me down, comparing me to Mia, and acting like she and her daughter were better than everyone else. And now here they were, begging for help because Mia had married a man who couldn't even pay his own rent. But the best part, my grandparents, who had been letting my aunt and Mia live with them rent-free for years, finally had enough. They kicked them out of the house, saying they were tired of all the drama. Now my aunt and Mia are renting a tiny apartment together, struggling to make ends meet. Nate is still trying to find steady work, but from what I hear, no one is eager to hire him. I won't lie. It felt good to hear about their struggles. Call it karma, call it justice, but after everything they put me through, I think they deserve every bit of it. By the time my Aunt Mia and Nate were all turning on each other, I felt like I was finally regaining control of my life. I had no intention of stepping back into the chaos, but as usual, they found ways to drag me back into the drama. A couple of weeks after my grandparents kicked my aunt and Mia out of their house, my mom called to let me know that they had shown up, again, this time with a sob story. Apparently, Mia was panicking because the landlord had given them an eviction notice after Nate failed to pay rent for the third month in a row. My aunt was desperate to find someone to blame, and predictably, they decided that person was me. They showed up here like they were storming the gates of a castle, my mom said, clearly trying to hold back laughter. Your aunt started ranting about how you're the reason Nate and Mia are struggling. She actually said, if she hadn't stolen that money, they'd be living comfortably right now. Can you believe that? I could believe it, unfortunately. My aunt had spent her entire life dodging accountability, so it was no surprise that she refused to take responsibility for her role in this disaster. After all, she had practically thrown Mia at Nate, convinced that marrying him would solve all of their problems. Now that it had blown up in her face, she was scrambling to pin the blame on someone else. But what really made me laugh was how delusional Mia sounded. According to my mom, she kept saying things like, I thought Nate was going to take care of me, and he promised we'd have a big house by now. The idea that Nate, a man who had been unemployed for over a year, could provide that kind of life was so ridiculous that I couldn't help but laugh. Still, the situation wasn't without its highlights. My dad, who had been mostly quiet throughout this whole ordeal, finally decided to speak his mind. When he heard my aunt yelling at my mom, he came downstairs and told her off. If Mia and Nate are so successful, why are they begging for money? He asked. Maybe instead of blaming my daughter, you should ask yourself why you thought it was a good idea to marry Mia off to a man who couldn't even pay his own bills. My aunt, of course, tried to deflect. She claimed she had no idea about Nate's financial problems and that I had deliberately hidden the truth from her. If she had told me, I would have never let this happen, she cried, as if her ignorance somehow excused her actions. But my dad wasn't having it. He reminded her that she had spent years treating me like a second-class citizen while putting Mia on a pedestal. You thought you were so clever, didn't you? He said. You stole my daughter's fiancé and called it a victory. But now that the truth is out, you're coming to us for help? Don't make me laugh. According to my mom, that's when things really started to unravel. Mia, who had been quiet up until that point, suddenly burst into tears and admitted that she was afraid of being homeless. Nate said he was going to take care of me, but he lied, she sobbed. I don't even think he loves me anymore. Apparently, Nate had been blaming Mia for their financial problems, accusing her of not contributing enough. This was hilarious, considering that Mia was working part-time as a receptionist, a job she only got because of a favor from my uncle, and Nate was barely making any money from his writing. The two of them had built their relationship on lies and deceit, and now it was crumbling under the weight of reality. But the real cherry on top came when my aunt started throwing Nate under the bus. I told Mia not to marry him, she claimed, conveniently forgetting that she had spent months bragging about their engagement. I knew he wasn't good enough for her, but she wouldn't listen. At that point, my dad had heard enough. He told my aunt and Mia to leave and never come back. You wanted to humiliate my daughter by parading Nate around like some kind of trophy, he said. Now that the tables have turned, you expect us to feel sorry for you? Get out. When my mom told me all of this, I couldn't stop laughing. The image of my aunt and Mia being kicked out of my parents' house was so satisfying that it almost made up for everything they had put me through. Almost. A few days later, I got an email from Nate. This time, he wasn't asking for money. He was apologizing. He admitted that he had made a huge mistake by marrying Mia and claimed that he had been manipulated by my aunt. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was, he wrote. I know I hurt you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. He went on to say that his life had fallen apart since we broke up. He was struggling to find work, his writing career was going nowhere, and his relationship with Mia was hanging by a thread. I wish I could take it all back, he said. I wish I had stayed with you. I didn't even bother responding. What was the point? Nate had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. He had chosen to betray me, and now he was dealing with the consequences of that choice. It wasn't my job to fix his life or make him feel better about his mistakes. Instead, I forwarded the email to my mom. Looks like karma finally caught up with him, I wrote. She replied with a single sentence, best Christmas gift ever. 2 years later, my life looks completely different from the mess it was back then. Living in Leeds has been the best decision I've ever made. I've built a solid career in my new job, made some amazing friends, and even started dating again. My boyfriend James is everything Nate wasn't: kind, respectful, and genuinely supportive of my goals. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm in a healthy, loving relationship, and I couldn't be happier. But as for Nate, Mia, and my aunt, let's just say karma has been working overtime. Shortly after the eviction debacle, my grandparents completely cut off my aunt financially. For years, she had been living off their generosity, letting them pay her bills and give her a roof over her head, while she did nothing to contribute. But after seeing how she manipulated Nate into marrying Mia, they decided enough was enough. They kicked her out, and she's been struggling ever since. Mia, on the other hand, has been stuck in a toxic marriage with Nate. From what I've heard through the family grapevine, their relationship went downhill fast. Nate blames Mia for their financial problems, claiming she tricked him into thinking she could support him while he pursued his writing career. Meanwhile, Mia is furious with Nate for lying about his income and failing to provide the lifestyle she thought she was marrying into. They argue constantly, and several relatives have told me they wouldn't be surprised if they divorced soon. And then there's Nate. Oh, Nate. The last I heard, he finally gave up on his writing dream and took a low-paying job in customer service just to make ends meet. He's miserable, of course, and spends most of his time complaining about how unfair life has been to him. Apparently, he still blames me for stealing the trust fund money, even though I've made it clear that I don't owe him a single penny. A few months ago, he sent me another email. This one was much shorter than the last, just a couple of sentences apologizing for everything and asking if we could start fresh. I didn't even bother responding. What was there to say? Nate made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. I have no interest in reopening that chapter of my life. But the most satisfying part of all this? My aunt has finally been forced to face the reality of her actions. For years, she treated me like I was less than Mia, constantly putting me down and making me feel like I wasn't good enough. She thought she had won when Nate left me for her daughter, but now she's living in a cramped apartment with no income, no support, and no hope of things getting better. And Mia, her precious golden child, is stuck in a marriage that's crumbling before her eyes. A few weeks ago, my mom called me with an update. Apparently, my aunt had been trying to reconnect with the family, hoping to get back into everyone's good graces. She even went so far as to apologize to my grandparents for her past behavior, claiming she was just trying to do what was best for Mia. My grandparents weren't buying it. They told her that until she took responsibility for her actions and made amends with me, they wanted nothing to do with her. My mom also mentioned that Mia had been asking around about divorce lawyers. It sounds like she's finally realizing that Nate isn't the Prince Charming she thought he was, my mom said. But honestly, what did she expect? She knew what she was getting into when she married him. Hearing all of this felt like validation. For so long, I had been painted as the villain in this story, the stubborn, selfish woman who drove Nate into Mia's arms. But now, the truth was coming to light. My aunt, Mia, and Nate had all dug their own graves, and now they were dealing with the fallout. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I had a great job, a loving boyfriend, and a life that felt entirely my own. Looking back, I can't believe how much my life has changed since the day my aunt showed up with that wedding invitation. At the time, I thought my world was ending. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and completely lost. But in hindsight, losing Nate was the best thing that ever happened to me. If he hadn't left, I might still be stuck in a one-sided relationship, pouring all my energy into supporting a man who didn't value me. Instead, I've built a life that I'm proud of, surrounded by people who truly care about me. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that karma is real. It might take time, but eventually, people get what they deserve. Nate, Mia, and my aunt thought they could hurt me and walk away unscathed, but life had other plans. And while they're busy dealing with the mess they created, I'm free to live my best life. To anyone reading this who's going through a similar situation, just know that it gets better. The pain doesn't last forever, and eventually, you'll come out stronger on the other side. And who knows, maybe karma will pay you a visit too.
The attic was suffocating, its musty air thick with secrets. I wiped sweat from my brow, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid of an old trunk. Nestled among yellowed newspapers and faded photographs, a bundle of letters caught my eye. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate yet urgent. "Rachel, are you still up there?" Dominic's voice floated up from below. I hesitated, my fingers grazing the frayed edges of the envelopes. "Just a minute," I called back, my heart racing. Quickly, I stuffed the letters into my pocket and closed the trunk. As I descended the rickety ladder, Dominic appeared at the bottom, his brow furrowed. "What were you doing up there?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his tone. I forced a smile. "Just looking for some old baby clothes. Thought we might be able to use them for Grace." Dominic's face softened. "Oh, right. Good idea." He glanced at his watch. "The boys will be home soon. I need to head out for a bit. Can you handle dinner?" I nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Of course. Go ahead." As soon as the front door closed behind him, I rushed to the kitchen and pulled out the letters with shaking hands. The return address bore the name Sarah Harper, Dominic's late wife. The first letter was dated 5 years ago, just months before Sarah's death. I began to read, my breath catching in my throat. "Dear Lucy and Ian, I'm writing to you in desperation. Things have gotten worse, and I fear for the boys' safety. Dominic's temper is out of control, and his parents enable his behavior. Please, I need your help." The sound of the front door opening startled me. I quickly shoved the letters back into my pocket as Ethan, my 15-year-old stepson, walked into the kitchen. "Hey," he mumbled, barely making eye contact. "Hi, Ethan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "How was school?" He shrugged, heading for the fridge. "Fine." I watched him, my mind reeling from what I'd just read. Was it possible? Had Dominic been abusive to Sarah? To the boys? "Where's Dad?" Ethan asked, breaking into my thoughts. "He had to run out for a bit," I replied. "He'll be back for dinner." Ethan nodded, then paused, studying my face. "Are you okay? You look kind of pale." I forced another smile. "I'm fine, just a little tired. Pregnancy, you know." His eyes flickered to my swollen belly, then back to my face. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of concern in his usually guarded expression. The front door opened again, and 12-year-old Max bounded in, all energy and smiles. "Rachel, can we have pizza for dinner?" I laughed, grateful for the distraction. "Not tonight, buddy. How about spaghetti?" As I busied myself with dinner preparations, my mind raced. What other secrets did those letters hold? And what was I going to do with this information? The sound of a car in the driveway made my stomach clench. Dominic was home. I heard his parents' voices as well. Beverly and Carl must have come for dinner. "Rachel?" Beverly's shrill voice called out. "Where are you hiding?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the evening ahead. As I turned to greet them, my hand unconsciously went to my pocket, feeling the weight of Sarah's letters against my hip. "In the kitchen!" I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. Whatever these letters revealed, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in this family would ever be the same again. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my hands resting on my swollen belly. 6 months pregnant, and I still couldn't believe it. A mix of joy and anxiety swirled inside me, much like the baby kicking beneath my palms. "Rachel?" Max's voice called from the hallway. "Can I come in?" I opened the door to find my younger stepson, his face bright with excitement. "Look what I made in art class," he thrust a clay figurine towards me. "It's beautiful, Max," I said, admiring the misshapen but lovingly crafted sculpture. "Is it for the baby?" He nodded eagerly. "Do you think she'll like it?" "She'll love it," I assured him, ruffling his hair. Max's acceptance had been a balm to my soul these past months, a stark contrast to Ethan's cold shoulder. As if summoned by my thoughts, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of indifference. "Dad wants to know if dinner's ready." I sighed, glancing at my watch. "I'll be down in a minute. Can you set the table, please?" Ethan shrugged and turned away without a word. Max gave me an apologetic look before scampering after his brother. Downstairs, I found Dominic in his study, buried in paperwork. "Honey," I said, knocking gently on the open door. "Dinner's almost ready." He looked up, distracted. "Oh, right. I'll be there in a sec." I hesitated, then plunged ahead. I was thinking, maybe we could tell the boys about the baby tonight? Dominic's brow furrowed. "Are you sure that's a good idea? Ethan's still adjusting to everything." "It's been over a year, Dominic," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "And I'm showing. We can't keep it a secret much longer." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, we'll tell them after dinner." The meal was a tense affair, with Ethan pushing food around his plate and Max trying to fill the silence with chatter about school. As we cleared the dishes, Dominic cleared his throat. "Boys, Rachel and I have some news," he began. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Max looked between us, curiosity written across his face. "We're going to have a baby," I said, my hand instinctively moving to my belly. "You're going to have a little sister." Max's face lit up. Really? That's awesome. He jumped up to hug me, nearly knocking me off balance. Ethan, however, remained stone-faced. Congratulations, he said flatly, pushing back from the table. May I be excused? Ethan, wait, Dominic called, but the boy was already halfway up the stairs. I felt tears pricking at my eyes. I'll go talk to him, I said, but Dominic shook his head. Let him cool off. I'll handle it later. But later never seemed to come with Dominic. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house grew thicker. Ethan retreated further into himself, while Max's excitement about the baby only seemed to widen the rift between the brothers. One afternoon I found myself alone in the house, the weight of Sarah's letters heavy in my mind. I hadn't dared read more since that first day, but now, with silence pressing in around me, I couldn't resist. I retrieved the bundle from its hiding place and began to read. Sarah's words painted a picture of a family in crisis. Dominic's temper, his parents' interference, her growing fear for her children's well-being. Tears streamed down my face as I read the final letter, dated just days before Sarah's death. If anything happens to me, she wrote, please, Lucy and Ian, take care of my boys. Don't let them forget that they're loved. The sound of the front door slamming jolted me back to reality. I quickly hid the letters as Ethan stormed into the kitchen. Ethan? I called, my voice shaky. Is everything okay? He whirled to face me, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and pain I'd never seen before. Why do you care? He spat. You're not my mother. You're just the woman who's trying to replace her. His words hit me like a physical blow. As he stormed upstairs, I sank into a chair, one hand on my belly, the other clutching Sarah's letters. In that moment, I realized that the family I'd thought I was joining was built on a foundation of secrets and pain, and I was caught right in the middle of it all. The doorbell chimed, and my heart sank. Beverly and Carl were early as usual. I smoothed my dress over my 8-month belly and plastered on a smile. Rachel, darling! Beverly's saccharine voice grated on my nerves as she swept into the house. My, you're looking robust. I bit back a retort. Hello, Beverly. Carl, please, come in. Carl grunted, eyeing me critically. Where's Dominic? Still at work, I replied, leading them to the living room. He should be home soon. Beverly sked. Working so late with a baby on the way? I hope you're not putting too much pressure on him, Rachel. I clenched my jaw. Dominic makes his own choices. Of course he does, Beverly said, her tone dripping with condescension. Now, where are my grandsons? As if on cue, Max bounded down the stairs. Grandma! Grandpa! He hugged them both, then turned to me. Rachel, can I show them the nursery? Before I could answer, Beverly interjected. Oh, you've been helping with the nursery? How sweet. I'm sure Rachel appreciates any help she can get, being so inexperienced. I saw Max's face fall slightly. Actually, I said, forcing my voice to remain calm, Max has been a huge help. He's got quite an eye for design. Beverly's lips thinned. Well, isn't that lovely? Carl, why don't you go with Max? I'd like to have a little chat with Rachel. My stomach clenched as Carl and Max headed upstairs. Beverly turned to me, her eyes cold. Rachel, dear, we need to discuss your influence on this family. I steeled myself. What do you mean, Beverly? Well, she began, her voice sickly sweet, we've noticed some changes since you arrived. Ethan's become so withdrawn, and now Max is playing interior decorator. It's just not natural. Not natural? I echoed, disbelief coloring my tone. Dominic tells us you're encouraging the boys to express themselves, she continued. That's not how we raised Dominic. Men in this family are strong, not emotional. I felt my temper rising. And look how well that turned out. I snapped before I could stop myself. Beverly's eyes widened. I beg your pardon? The front door opened, saving me from having to respond. Dominic walked in, looking tired. Mom, what are you doing here? He asked, confusion evident in his voice. Beverly's demeanor changed instantly. Oh, honey, we just came to check on you all. We're worried about the stress you're under. Dominic's brow furrowed. What stress? Beverly glanced pointedly at my belly. Well, with the baby coming and Rachel clearly struggling to manage the household. I'm not struggling, I interjected, but Dominic was already nodding. It has been tough, he admitted, but we're managing. I stared at him, hurt and anger warring inside me. Dominic, can I speak with you in the kitchen? Once alone, I rounded on him. Why didn't you tell me your parents were coming? He shrugged. I forgot. What's the big deal? The big deal, I hissed, is that your mother just spent the last 10 minutes criticizing everything about our life. Dominic sighed. Rachel, you're overreacting. That's just how Mom is. And you just let her talk to me like that? I felt tears pricking at my eyes. Look, he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. My parents are important to me. If you can't handle them, maybe you need to try harder. I stepped back, shocked. Try harder? Dominic, I've been trying since the day I moved in. But your parents hate me. Ethan can barely look at me, and you don't even see what's happening. What's happening, he growled, is that you're turning my family against me. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I opened my mouth to respond, but a sharp pain in my abdomen made me gasp instead. Dominic's anger morphed into concern. Rachel? What's wrong? I clutched my belly, panic rising. I think the baby's coming. As Dominic rushed to call the hospital, I leaned against the counter, breathing heavily. Through the haze of pain, one thought crystallized in my mind. Something had to change, and soon. For my sake, for the boy's sake, and now, for my daughter's sake, too. The shrill cry of Grace pierced the early morning silence, jolting me awake. I stumbled out of bed, exhaustion weighing heavily on my bones. It had been 3 months since her dramatic arrival, and I felt like I hadn't slept since. As I cradled Grace, trying to soothe her, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, hair a mess, and clothes that hadn't been changed in days. I barely recognized myself. Rachel? Dominic's voice called from downstairs. My parents are here. Can you come down? I froze, panic rising in my chest. Beverly and Carl were here? Now? I looked down at Grace, finally quiet, then back at my disheveled reflection. There was no time to make myself presentable. Descending the stairs, I could hear Beverly's voice, sharp and critical. Really, Dominic, the house is a mess. I thought Rachel was supposed to be taking care of things. I stepped into the living room, Grace in my arms. Good morning, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Beverly's eyes widened as she took in my appearance. Oh my, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Rachel, dear, you look, well, I suppose new motherhood isn't easy for everyone. I felt my cheeks burn with shame and anger. I'm doing my best, I said through gritted teeth. Carl grunted. Doesn't look like much of a best to me. I looked to Dominic, silently pleading for support, but he avoided my gaze. Mom, Dad, why don't we go out for breakfast? He suggested. Give Rachel some time to get things in order. The implication stung. As they left, I sank onto the couch, tears threatening to spill over. Grace began to fuss again, and I felt utterly overwhelmed. Suddenly, Ethan appeared in the doorway. His eyes darted between me and the baby, a mix of concern and uncertainty on his face. Are you okay? He asked hesitantly. I tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. I'm fine, Ethan, just tired. He shifted uncomfortably. I could hold her for a bit, if you want to shower or something. His offer caught me off guard. You'd do that? Ethan shrugged. Yeah, I guess. I mean, she is my sister. Gratitude washed over me as I carefully transferred Grace to Ethan's arms. As I headed upstairs, I heard him talking softly to her, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. But reality came crashing back when I returned to find Dominic and his parents had returned. Beverly was holding Grace, cooing at her while shooting pointed looks in my direction. There you are, Rachel, she said. We were just discussing how you might need some help, perhaps a nanny? I bristled. We don't need a nanny. I can take care of my own child. Beverly's smile was cold. Of course, dear, but with the house in such a state and you looking so worn out, we're just concerned. We? I looked at Dominic, who shifted uncomfortably. Rachel, he began, his tone placating, maybe Mom has a point. You have been struggling lately. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Struggling? Dominic, I've been doing everything, taking care of Grace, the boys, the house, while I what? Dominic's voice took on a dangerous edge. While I worked to support this family? The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Even Beverly looked taken aback by Dominic's tone. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I thought of Sarah's letters, hidden away. I thought of Ethan's small act of kindness, and I thought of my daughter, who deserved better than this toxic environment. You know what? I said, my voice low and steady. You're right. I do need help, but not from a nanny, and certainly not from you. I turned to Ethan, who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Ethan, can you take Grace upstairs, please? As Ethan left with the baby, I faced Dominic and his parents. "This ends now," I declared. "I'm done being the scapegoat for this family's problems. Either things change, or I'm leaving, and I'm taking my daughter with me." The shock on their faces would have been satisfying if I wasn't trembling inside. But as I stood there, chin held high, I knew I had reached a turning point. Whatever came next, I was ready to fight for myself and my children. All of them. The fluorescent lights of the office buzzed overhead, matching the constant thrum of anxiety in my chest. I stared at the computer screen, the words blurring before my eyes. My head pounded, a dull ache that had become my constant companion. "Rachel?" My colleague Sarah peered over the cubicle wall. "Are you okay? You look pale." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. Grace had a rough night." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "You've been just tired for weeks now. Maybe you should see a doctor?" Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from Dominic. "Mom and Dad coming for dinner. Don't forget to pick up Grace from daycare." My stomach churned. Another evening of criticism and tension. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. "Rachel?" Sarah's voice seemed distant. "Rachel, you're shaking." I opened my eyes to find the room spinning. Suddenly, the floor rushed up to meet me. I came to on a couch in the break room, surrounded by concerned faces. Our HR manager, Linda, knelt beside me. "Rachel, we've called an ambulance. You fainted," she explained gently. Panic surged through me. "No, I can't go to the hospital. I have to pick up Grace and dinner." "Your health comes first," Linda insisted. "We've contacted your husband. He's on his way to the hospital." The next few hours passed in a blur of tests and questions. When the doctor finally entered my room, his expression was grave. "Mrs. Harper, your blood pressure is dangerously high. You're showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. If you don't make some significant changes, you're at risk for serious complications." I nodded numbly, barely registering his words. All I could think about was Grace and the boys and the mountain of tasks waiting for me at home. The door burst open, and Dominic rushed in, followed closely by Beverly and Carl. My heart sank at the sight of them. "Rachel, what happened?" Dominic demanded. "Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" Before I could answer, Beverly chimed in. "I knew she couldn't handle it all." "Dominic, this is what happens when you let a career woman try to run a household." Anger flared within me, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. "Excuse me?" Carl grunted. "Face it, girl, you bit off more than you could chew. It's time to admit you need help." I looked to Dominic, silently pleading for support, but he avoided my gaze. "Maybe they're right, Rachel. You're clearly overwhelmed." Something inside me snapped. "Overwhelmed? Of course I'm overwhelmed. I'm working full-time, taking care of an infant and 2 teenagers, managing a household, and dealing with constant criticism from your parents. And where have you been, Dominic? Where's your support?" The room fell silent. Dominic's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "That's not fair, Rachel. I work hard to provide for this family." "And I don't?" I shot back. "When was the last time you got up for a 3 a.m. feeding, or helped with homework, or stood up to your parents when they belittle me?" Beverly gasped. "How dare you speak to him like that? After everything we've done for you." "Enough!" I shouted, surprising even myself. "I'm done. I'm done trying to please everyone while sacrificing my own health and happiness." I turned to Dominic, my voice shaking but resolute. "Things need to change, Dominic. Either we get counseling and you start setting boundaries with your parents, or what?" Dominic's voice was dangerously low. I took a deep breath, the weight of my next words hanging in the air. "Or I'm leaving, and I'm taking Grace with me." The stunned silence that followed was broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. In that moment, staring into Dominic's shocked face, I knew there was no going back. Whatever came next, I had to prioritize my health and my children's well-being. The time for compromise was over. Now, it was time to fight. I stood in the kitchen, mechanically stirring a pot of soup, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The house was eerily quiet. Dominic had taken Grace to his parents for the day, a thinly veiled attempt to give me a break after my hospital scare. But the silence only amplified my inner turmoil. A soft knock on the doorframe startled me. I turned to see Ethan hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Rachel?" His voice was hesitant. "Can we talk?" I nodded, surprised. "Of course. Come in." Ethan sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting with a folded piece of paper. I found something in Dad's study. My heart raced as he unfolded the paper. It was a letter, the handwriting achingly familiar, Sarah's handwriting. "It's from my mom," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "She wrote it right before she died. I think you should read it." With trembling hands, I took the letter. As I read, Sarah's words burned into my mind. "Dominic, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I can't take it anymore. The anger, the control, the fear. I'm leaving, and I'm taking the boys with me. Your parents have poisoned our family for too long. I won't let them do to our children what they did to you. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. Please find help, break the cycle, for our boys' sake." I looked up at Ethan, tears blurring my vision. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so sorry. She never got to leave. The accident, it wasn't an accident, was it?" The weight of this revelation crashed over me. Suddenly everything, Dominic's temper, his parents' interference, the boy's pain, clicked into horrifying focus. "Ethan," I said, my voice shaking, "I need you to listen to me. What's happening in this family isn't right. It wasn't right for your mother, and it's not right for us now." Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know, I've known for a while. I didn't know what to do." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "I'm going to leave your father, and I want to take you, Max, and Grace with me." Ethan's eyes widened. "You do that? Even for us?" "Of course," I said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're my family too, Ethan. All of you." Just then we heard the front door open. Dominic's voice called out, "Rachel, we're home." Panic flashed across Ethan's face. I quickly folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. "It's okay," I whispered. "We'll figure this out." Dominic appeared in the doorway, Grace in his arms. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene before him. "What's going on here?" I stood up, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "Dominic, we need to talk about everything." His face darkened. "Everything? What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "that I know about Sarah, about what really happened, and I'm not going to let history repeat itself." The color drained from Dominic's face. He set Grace down, his movements suddenly jerky and aggressive. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "I know enough," I shot back, "and I'm done pretending. This ends now, Dominic, for all our sakes." Ethan stood up, moving to stand beside me. "She's right, Dad. We can't keep living like this." Dominic's eyes darted between us, a cornered animal. "You're turning my own son against me?" he growled, taking a step forward. I instinctively pushed Ethan behind me, shielding him. "No, Dominic. You did that all on your own." As Dominic advanced, rage contorting his features, I realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment everything would change. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, I had to be ready to fight. Not just for myself, but for all 4 children who were counting on me. With one hand reaching for Grace and the other holding Ethan's arm, I braced myself for the storm that was about to break. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "I want a divorce, Dominic." His face contorted with rage, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "You what?" I stood my ground, heart racing but voice steady. "You heard me. I'm leaving, and I'm taking the children with me." Dominic's laugh was cold, mirthless. "You think you can just walk away? Take my kids?" "Our kids," I corrected. "And yes, I can. I will." His eyes darted to Ethan, who stood beside me, then to Max, who had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "Boys," Dominic said, his voice dangerously calm, "go to your rooms, now." Neither moved. Max spoke up, his voice trembling but determined. "No, Dad. We're staying with Rachel." Dominic's facade cracked. "What did you say to them?" He snarled at me. "How dare you turn my own children against me?" "We made our own choice," Ethan said. "We know what you did to Mom, what you've been doing to all of us." The color drained from Dominic's face. "You don't know anything," he hissed. "We know enough," I said, pulling Sarah's letter from my pocket. "And so will the police if you try to stop us." Dominic lunged forward, but Ethan stepped between us. "Don't touch her," he warned. For a moment, I saw a flicker of shock in Dominic's eyes, as if truly seeing his son for the first time. Then his expression hardened. "Fine," he spat. "Leave, but don't think this is over." As we hurried to pack essentials, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Lucy Miller. We need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. Ethan and Max's maternal grandparents, the ones Dominic had kept away for years. I quickly replied, arranging to meet them. Hours later, we sat in a quiet cafe, the boys reuniting tearfully with their grandparents. Lucy clutched my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "We've been trying to reach them for so long." Ian's face was grim. "We always suspected something was wrong, but Dominic kept us away, said we were a bad influence." "He was the bad influence," Max said bitterly. "Him and his parents." A chill ran down my spine. "His parents," I repeated. "Oh God, Beverly and Carl, they'll be furious when they find out." As if on cue, my phone exploded with notifications. Missed calls from Beverly, threatening texts from Carl, and a voicemail from Dominic that made my blood run cold. "You think you've won?" His voice slurred, clearly drunk. "This isn't over. I'll take everything from you. The kids, the house, everything. You'll regret the day you crossed me, Rachel." I looked up at the concerned faces around me. "We need to go," I said urgently. "It's not safe here anymore." Lucy squeezed my hand. "Come stay with us. We have plenty of room and Dominic doesn't know where we live." As we drove to Lucy and Ian's house, my mind raced. How had it come to this? Running from the man I once loved with 4 children depending on me? Ethan's voice broke into my thoughts. "Rachel, are we going to be okay?" I met his eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing the fear and hope battling there. I thought of Sarah's letter, of the years of abuse and manipulation, of the strength it took to break free. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We're going to be okay. It won't be easy, but we're together now, and we're going to fight for the life we deserve." As we pulled up to Lucy and Ian's house, I saw Beverly and Carl's car parked across the street. My heart plummeted. How had they found us so quickly? "Stay in the car?" I told the children, my voice tight with fear. "Lock the doors. I'll handle this." As I stepped out to face my in-laws, I knew this was it, the moment that would define our future. Everything was at stake, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. I stood on the porch, my heart pounding as Beverly and Carl approached. Behind me, I could hear Lucy and Ian ushering the children inside. "Where do you think you're going with our grandchildren?" Beverly's shrill voice cut through the air. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "They're safe, Beverly. That's all that matters." Carl's face reddened. "You have no right to take them, Dominic." "Dominic lost that right," I interrupted, my voice steady. "And so did you." Just then, a car screeched to a halt behind them. Dominic stumbled out, his eyes wild with rage. "You," he snarled, pointing at me. "You've ruined everything." As he lurched towards me, Ethan burst out of the house, placing himself between us. "Stop right there, Dad," he warned. Dominic froze, shock momentarily replacing anger. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "Protecting my family," Ethan replied, his voice trembling but resolute. "The way you never did." Beverly gasped. "How dare you speak to your father that way?" "No," I said, stepping forward. "How dare you all treat these children like possessions instead of people? How dare you continue the cycle of abuse that nearly destroyed Sarah?" Carl's face paled. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out Sarah's letter, my hand shaking. "I know everything. About Sarah's plan to leave, about the accident that wasn't an accident, and so do the police." As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Dominic's face contorted with fury and fear. "You bitch," he spat. "You'll pay for this." He lunged forward, but Ethan was quicker. In a move that spoke of years of pent-up anger, he shoved his father back. Dominic stumbled, falling hard on the pavement. As the police cars pulled up, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Officers swarmed around us, separating Dominic and his parents from the rest of us. I watched as they were handcuffed and read their rights, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Max appeared at my side, slipping his hand into mine. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice small. I squeezed his hand. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." Hours later, after statements had been given and plans set in motion, we sat in Lucy and Ian's living room. Grace slept peacefully in my arms, while Ethan and Max leaned against me on either side. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I looked around at the faces of our newfound family, Lucy and Ian beaming with joy at being reunited with their grandsons, the boys finally free from the weight of secrets and fear, and little Grace innocent and unaware of the seismic shift in our world. "Now," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "we heal. We build a new life, one filled with love and honesty and support." Lucy reached out, squeezing my hand. "You're not alone in this, Rachel. We're all here for you and the children." I felt tears welling up, but for the first time in years they were tears of relief and hope. "Thank you," I whispered. "All of you. For being brave, for standing up for what's right." As the evening wore on, plans were made. Lucy and Ian offered us a place to stay until we could get back on our feet. We talked about therapy, about legal proceedings, about rebuilding our lives. Later that night, as I tucked the children into bed, Ethan caught my hand. "Rachel," he said softly, "I'm sorry I was so hard on you before. You saved us, just like Mom tried to do." I felt my heart swell with love and pride. "Oh, Ethan," I said, pulling him into a hug, "you saved us too. We all did together." As I closed their bedroom door, I paused in the hallway, overwhelmed by the events of the day. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt hope blooming in my chest. We had broken free from the cycle of abuse and silence. We had chosen love over fear, truth over lies, and in doing so, we had found not just safety, but a true family, one built on trust, respect, and unconditional love. As I settled into bed, exhausted but at peace, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Our journey of healing had only just begun, but we were finally on the right path, and that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. "Pregnant again? How utterly disappointing." Marla's words sliced through the tense silence like a butcher's knife. My stomach dropped as I slowly looked up from my plate at my mother-in-law's sneering face. Evan shifted uncomfortably beside me, but stayed silent as usual. Marla continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Another daughter, I assume? When are you going to give my son the heir he deserves?" I felt the blood drain from my face as the weight of her words slammed into me. This was supposed to be a joyful celebration dinner for my pregnancy, but Marla had once again managed to turn it into a humiliation. "Mother, please," Evan finally muttered, but she waved him off dismissively. "Don't mother me. You're just as frustratingly submissive as your father was. If you don't control your wife, she'll keep popping out these disappointing female placeholders." Tears stung my eyes as I finally found my voice. "Zoe is not a placeholder. She's our beloved daughter, and this pregnancy is still early. We don't know the sex yet." "Oh, spare me." Marla rolled her eyes. "With your atrocious track record, it's clearly another girl. You're a broodmare failure." The venom in her tone shook me to my core. Evan's head hung low, crushed by his mother's verbal lashing. Hurt and rage burned inside me, but I knew defending myself was futile against this woman's cruelty. I need some air," I managed to choke out, pushing back from the table. I had to escape before breaking down completely. Marla scoffed as I rushed away. "Running away again, are we?" Typical. I hurried out to the back patio, gulping in the cool night air as burning tears streaked my cheeks. How could she be so hateful and demeaning toward me? Footsteps approached, and I tensed, steeling myself for another barrage of insults. But it was Evan, his face etched with sadness and apologetic. "Lena, I'm so sorry. She was completely out of line back there," he said softly, taking my hand. "You know how important you and the kids are to me. Don't listen to her vitriol." I pulled my hand away, suddenly angry at his passivity. "But I did listen, Evan. For 8 years, I've listened to her constant put-downs and cruelty toward me, toward Zoe. When are you finally going to stand up to your mother?" Evan's eyes widened, then quickly averted. You know how she is. She'll never change," he mumbled weakly. I felt something inside me harden at his words. For the first time, I truly saw Evan's inability, or unwillingness, to protect me from his mother's abuse. In that moment, the illusion of our marriage began cracking before my eyes. As I looked into my husband's beaten, submissive stance, I realized with sinking dread that this pattern would never end. Marla's iron grip over him was unbreakable, and I was the perpetual target for her destructive need to dominate. Warily, I turned and headed back inside, leaving Evan standing alone with his spineless excuses. I sensed this was the beginning of an inescapable downward spiral that would alter my family forever. If only I knew then just how devastating the consequences would be. The tension hung thick in the air as Marla smoothed her silk blouse, a self-satisfied smirk playing across her lips. "Lena, dear, I have some news that may shake things up a bit." I eyed her warily from across the kitchen counter. "What are you talking about?" "Well, you know how concerned I've been about securing a legitimate heir for my son," she began in a mock-sympathetic tone. "A daughter is lovely, but it simply won't do for carrying on the family legacy. Rage simmered within me, but I bit my tongue. After the disastrous dinner weeks ago, I knew any protest would be futile against this woman's twisted agenda. Marla continued, "So, I took matters into my own hands to help solve this delicate issue. I introduced Evan to a wonderful young lady, Sienna. She's fertile, devoted, and more than capable of providing him with the son he deserves." The words hung in the air like a bad dream. But Marla's vindictive stare told me this was no nightmare. It was disgustingly real. You brought another woman into our marriage to have a baby with my husband?" I sputtered, struggling to process this depths of her depravity. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she scoffed. "I'm doing what's best for my son's future. You've proven quite incapable in that regard." The casual cruelty of her words struck me like physical blows. How could anyone be so utterly lacking in human empathy? "You cruel, manipulative hag," I cried out, unable to contain my anger any longer. "Does Evan even know about this vile scheme?" A slow, satisfied smile spread across Marla's face. "Why don't you ask him yourself, dear?" On cue, Evan stepped into the room, flanked by a slim, overly made-up woman I didn't recognize. Sienna, I presumed. The look of sheepish contrition on my husband's face said it all. You allowed this? Your own mother brought another woman into our marriage to bear your child?" I stammered, feeling the world crumbling around me. Evan couldn't meet my eyes. "Lena, we've talked about how important carrying on the family line is. So you're just going to let your mother pimp out some cheap whore to get what she wants?" I screamed, uncaring of the foul language as blinding rage took over. Sienna's eyebrows shot up in feigned indignation. Evan finally looked at me, his expression hardening to match his mother's callous demeanor. "This is for the greater good, Lena. My duty as a man. If you were able to do your wifely duties properly, we wouldn't need to go to such extremes." His cold, rehearsed words lanced through my heart like daggers. This was really happening. My own husband was utterly betraying me in the most humiliating way possible, all with his mother's enthusiastic support. Marla chuckled at my stunned silence. "Don't worry, dear. Once Sienna properly breeds, you can focus your energy on my granddaughter. We wouldn't want you feeling completely useless." Her words ignited an indescribable fury within me that I never knew I possessed. With a primal scream, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and hurled it with every ounce of strength. It struck Marla squarely in her smug face, shattering viciously and spraying blood and ceramic shards across the room. Sienna shrieked in horror as Marla crumpled to the floor, clutching her ruined face and howling in agony. Chest heaving, I turned to Evan, seeing the shock and fear in his eyes. In that unrestrained moment, I knew my marriage had disintegrated into ashes. There would be no forgiving this ultimate betrayal. Marla's monstrous machinations had cut straight through the very core of my world. The only thing left was vengeance. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air as Marla's wails finally subsided. I stood motionless, fists clenched, glaring at the crumpled, bleeding form of my monstrous mother-in-law on the kitchen floor. Evan stared at me with a mixture of shock and fear. Beside him, Sienna shrank back, clearly shaken by my outburst, but still clinging to her role in this sick charade. You crazy bitch!" Marla's trembling voice finally broke the tension, thick with a combination of pain and rage. "I'll see you arrested for this. Assaulting me in my own home." "Your home?" I scoffed, unable to contain the sudden resurgence of fury rippling through me. "This is my home, the home I made with my husband, the man you're trying to pimp out behind my back like some kind of degenerate mother-pimping monster." Marla opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "No, don't even try denying it, you hateful crone. I heard everything, how you willingly brought this woman into my marriage explicitly to cuckold your own son." I turned my fiery glare to Evan, who flinched as if struck. "And you spineless coward, going along with your mother's demented plans, ready to stick your dick into the first fertile womb she picks for you." "Lena," he began weakly, but I wasn't about to let him make pathetic excuses. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just be a good little wifey while you knocked up some cheap hussy on the side?" "Hey!" Sienna's shrill voice cut in, her fake-baked face contorting with indignation. "I am not some hussy! Your bastard husband came on to me." I whirled on the overly made-up woman, feeling a cruel smile spread across my face. Did he now? So tell me, when you were spreading your legs for a very married man, did you stop to think about his innocent family you were helping to destroy? Sienna opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Deep down, even she realized how reprehensible her role was in this sordid scheme. Chuckling darkly, I turned back to Evan. Unfreaking believable. I gave you everything. A beautiful child, a loving home, an amazing life. And you were ready to just throw it all away to satisfy your mother's unhinged breeding fetish. Marla stirred, glaring up at me, her face already starting to grotesquely swell from the vase impact. You have no one to blame but yourself, you infertile. Enough, I roared, slamming my fist down on the counter, hard enough to make them all jump. I have had it with your bottomless well of cruelty and manipulation. If having a son is so obsessively important, then Evan is welcome to it. Striding over to a small desk, I snatched up a pen and a sheaf of papers, thrusting them toward Evan with cheeks burning. Separation agreement. You can have your son's situation, your freedom to breed some new little heirs with that plastic surgery disaster over there. Evan gaped, stunned into silence. Even Sienna seemed jolted by my actions as the gravity of the situation sank in. Well? I demanded through gritted teeth. Sign it and get out! Take your vile, treacherous mother and your stupid son quest and just go. I want you out of my house, out of my life. Slowly, numbly, Evan took the pen and stared at the agreement. A heavy pause seemed to blanket the room as Marla and Sienna looked on with matching expressions, a mixture of surprise and sickening satisfaction. Then, with a trembling hand, Evan scrawled his name in harsh strokes across the papers, officially ending our marriage in that single callous gesture, as his mother had always intended. Exhaling hard, I snatched the signed pages back from his hand, our eyes locking in one last, searingly intense glare. Then I turned and walked upstairs without another word, clutching the proof of my broken world and wondering how I would ever be able to piece my shattered life back together. The next few days passed in a numb blur. Evan and his mother had stormed out after the confrontation, taking their co-conspirator Sienna with them. An eerie silence descended over the house I once thought of as my loving home. I drifted aimlessly, my mind struggling to process the devastating implosion of my marriage. Logically, I knew signing those separation papers was the only recourse after Evan's unforgivable betrayal. And yet, the overwhelming sense of loss threatened to swallow me whole at times. Zoe, our 8-year-old daughter, seemed to pick up on the heavy tension despite my efforts to shield her. She became quieter, clingier, her usual bright exuberance dimming. "Mommy, where did Daddy go?" she asked one evening as we picked at our dinner in silence. I froze, unprepared for the question. Part of me wanted to proclaim the ugly truth, that her father had abandoned us to chase some atavistic need to breed an heir with another woman. But I couldn't bring myself to shatter her innocence so completely. "Daddy had to go away for a little while, honey," I hedged, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Work things." Zoe frowned, clearly picking up on my emotional disquiet. Ever the empath, just like her mother. "Are you sad, Mommy? Did you and Daddy have a fight?" "Something like that, baby," I managed, fighting back the lump swelling in my throat. "But everything will be okay, I promise." The lie tasted like ashes on my tongue, because in that moment there was no way to see how anything could ever be okay again. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. Zoe looked up, eyes wide with something like hope. "Is that Daddy?" "Stay here, sweetie," I said quickly, rising to answer the door with trepidation curling in my stomach. But it wasn't Evan on the other side. Instead, a sharply dressed man in an expensive suit stood with a crisp folder in his hands. "Mrs. Redding?" he asked brusquely without preamble. "I'm Mr. Collins, an associate of your husband's." An icy fist gripped my heart as I suddenly sensed where this was headed. The separation had clearly begun the legal fractures. "My firm has prepared these documents for you to review and sign," Mr. Collins continued, all business as he held out the folder. Hesitantly, I accepted the hefty stack of papers, dread settling like a cold stone in my gut. This was really happening, the death knell of my marriage after Evan's sickening betrayal. As I mechanically paged through the legalese, certain phrases jumped out in harsh simplicity. Petition for dissolution of marriage, rendered the covenant irreparably broken, division of assets favoring the male issue-bearing party. I felt the blood drain from my face as awful realization bloomed. This wasn't just a simple divorce agreement. It was Evan and his demonic mother wielding their wealth and influence to strip me of everything, my home, my life, my child, all in cruel pursuit of their deranged male heir vendetta. "You have 48 hours to review and sign these terms, Mrs. Redding," Mr. Collins stated flatly. "After that, my client will pursue more aggressive recourse if you fail to comply." The unmistakable threat laced his words like arsenic. Memories flashed of the unrestrained violence that ran in Marla's virulent veins, the vase, the bloodshed, of her unstoppable quest to destroy any obstacle to the grandchild she craved. My treacherous, spineless husband had clearly thrown in with his vile mother. He would stop at nothing to cut me out of his life completely, all for the unforgivable sin of bearing him a daughter instead of a son. A cold, dead feeling settled over me, the final vestige of our broken marriage crumbling to bitter ash. There would be no more tears, no more desperate pleas or self-delusions. I was truly and utterly alone now, except for my innocent little girl watching in sad confusion from the next room, the pure, bright spirit that was supposed to be my greatest joy. But in that stark moment she became my sole lifeline, my unbreakable reason to endure the coming storm. I turned to Mr. Collins, my jaw rigid. "Tell your client that after 48 hours he can expect to hear from my attorney," I stated in a toneless rasp, "because I'll be damned if I let him take my daughter too." With that, I shut the door in the lawyer's face. Then I turned and pulled a confused Zoe into my arms, holding her tiny form as if she were a life vest in a raging sea. There would be no surrender, no matter how viciously Evan and Marla tried to drown me. For Zoe's sake, I would find a way to stay afloat and make them pay dearly for their twisted sins. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim determination. I knew time was short before Evan and Marla would attempt to strip me of everything I held dear. First, I secured a shark of a divorce attorney, Caroline Weston. Steely, aggressive, and with a reputation for devouring entitled rich husbands like Evan. "This is one of the most blatant, unethical cases of alienation of affection I've ever seen," Caroline stated in a cold fury after I recounted the sordid details. "We're going to crucify this bastard and his Medea of a mother." Her words kindled a flame of hope that I could indeed survive this nightmare with my daughter and some shreds of dignity intact. Next was gathering ammunition, any proof of Evan's misdeeds that could be leveraged in the coming war. I pored over financial records, discovering his company had been filtering money to an offshore account for years. Embezzlement and tax evasion, potentially criminal behavior if exposed. Perfect leverage. Finally, I arranged for Zoe's temporary relocation while the legal battle raged. My sister Nina, an elementary school teacher, lived 2 states over. I knew she could shelter and care for my sweet girl while I fought in the trenches. When the 48-hour deadline arrived, I was ready, or as ready as I could be. Mr. Collins arrived promptly with the same aloof disdain as before. "I trust you've had ample time to review the terms and come to an amenable decision," he stated flatly. In response, I slid the signed divorce petition across the table, but not the one he provided. The stack of papers bore Caroline Weston's imprimatur, every word thoroughly negotiated for maximum impact. Mr. Collins' eyes flashed with surprise as he scanned the unrecognized document, his brows knitting in disapproval. "This was not the agreement we discussed. My client will need to reevaluate these terms." "These are the terms," I stated coldly. "I refuse to be bullied or stonewalled. Every nefarious act, every awful betrayal has consequences." I slid the thick dossier of financial documentation across the table, watching Mr. Collins's face blanch slightly as he grasped the implications. "Your client's illegal corporate dealings have been rigorously catalogued by very credible forensic accountants," I added with a hint of vindictive satisfaction. "Any attempt to deprive me of my legal marital rights and claim over my daughter will be met with the full public revelation of these damning records." I allowed that threat to hang in the air. Evan's ego and insecurity about his business reputation were thinly veiled weak spots, traits his vile mother had eagerly exploited countless times. Now it was my turn to wield that leverage. Mr. Collins maintained an impressively impassive poker face as he studied the documentation, though a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw. Perhaps he was already calculating how hard this battle could hit Evan's pocketbook. "I will present this counteroffer to Mr. Redding in full," he said finally, voice tight, "contingent on these materials remaining discreet for now." "See that you do," I said simply. "The meter is running on flaying his reputation and criminal liability wide open." With a curt nod, Mr. Collins collected the documents and departed, clearly reeling from this unanticipated turn of events. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faintest spark of hope, of reclaiming some portion of my life and dignity from Evan and Marla's grasping claws. But there was still one vital loose end to secure before the war began in earnest. I turned and gathered Zoe into my arms, fighting back fresh tears at her sad, bewildered expression. "Mommy," she said tremulously, "what's happening? I want Daddy to come home." I hushed her gently, stroking her soft hair. "I know, baby, I know. But you have to go stay with Auntie Nina for a little while, okay? For your safety." Zoe's eyes widened slightly, picking up on the undercurrent of tension. But she nodded obediently. As I clutched her tiny form, I silently vowed to do whatever it took to protect my daughter's well-being, even inscribing her name permanently in the chasm dividing our family. There would be hurt and confusion, but I hoped she would eventually understand. Because in the end, I would make absolutely certain that Evan and Marla paid the ultimate price for their monstrous transgressions. Once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The divorce battle erupted with a fury I could scarcely have imagined. Evan and Marla clearly felt spurned by my refusal to capitulate, and were determined to crush me through overwhelming legal force and intimidation. Caroline proved to be worth every penny, matching their team's viciousness tit for tat. Accusations and exposures flew in both directions as dark secrets were mercilessly excavated. Marla launched a public smear campaign, portraying me as an unfit mother and spouse jealous of Evan's business success. We countered by leaking details of her deranged campaign to cuckold her own son for a male heir. It was a brutal, soul-destroying process. But I refused to surrender an inch, kept afloat by my determination to maintain stability for Zoe. Finally, after 6 excruciating months, cooler heads in Evan's camp prevailed in pushing for a negotiated settlement, an end to the scorched earth hostilities before any more radioactive scandals fully combusted. I'll never forget the heavy silence that fell over the sterile conference room as our respective legal teams arrived. Evan entered, shoulders squared but eyes hollowed by the long battle. Then Marla swept in, her face still bearing the faintest scars from the vase incident, twisted into her trademark sneer. I felt a brief thrill of satisfaction that at least I'd managed to mar her unbearably smug exterior. Greetings were dispensed with, having long abandoned such niceties. We came straight to business. My client is prepared to offer a full and impartial distribution of legitimate marital assets, provided certain conditions are met, Caroline stated firmly, including permanent renunciation of custodial claims over the minor child. I could feel Marla's glare burning a hole through me. Sacrificing any claim to Zoe was the heaviest concession, but a necessary one to secure safety and healing. To her credit, Caroline didn't flinch, as well as assurances that the unconventional reproductive circumstances during the marriage remained sealed and undisclosed. A harsh jab at the twisted heir conspiracy, and a not-so-veiled threat about potential criminal repercussions. Evan shifted uncomfortably at the allusion. Marla's scowl deepened. "While such terms are highly irregular," their lead counsel replied stiffly, "we are amenable to the equity distribution, provided indemnity against future potential actions." A ugly pause lingered. They knew their financial skullduggery had been thoroughly exposed and could jeopardize not just Evan's business, but potential imprisonment. So they had no choice but to negotiate a suppression of the whole sordid truth. The tables had finally turned in my favor. "Of course, so long as commitments are adhered to, the matters will remain permanently sealed," Caroline stated, her shark-like smile just a touch too wide. The negotiation continued for hours, splitting immense assets and investments down to the finest decimal point. But in the end, we hammered out an agreement, secured by both sides of mutual sustaining silence. Marla looked utterly miserable, faced with irrevocably surrendering control over her son's life and Zoe's. While still obscenely wealthy, I knew the concessions represented a profound personal defeat, which fueled my resolve. "I don't expect congratulations," Caroline told me in an undertone as the final paperwork was prepared. "This whole situation is equal parts sickening and infuriating, but you stood your ground and secured the best path for your daughter's well-being." I could only nod numbly, my strength finally waning after the marathon ordeal. There was no jubilation or catharsis, only the cold satisfaction of having survived this battle, of inflicting some semblance of consequences on Evan and Marla for their grotesque transgressions, and ensuring a future of stability for Zoe. Sliding the notarized agreement across the desk, I met Marla's seething glare one last time. "Don't ever set foot near me or my daughter again, you twisted, evil bitch." Too weary even to revel in her impotent sputtering at the insult, I simply stood and walked out, gathering the last remnants of my dignity to forge a path into this new, uncertain life. There was still one final loose end to tie up, and I intended to cut Marla's last thread of delusion with utmost precision. With the divorce settlement finalized and my financial future secured, I could finally turn my focus to rebuilding my life, our life, free from Evan and Marla's toxic orbit. My first priority was reintegrating with Zoe. The poor girl had been shuttled between relatives for months, kept at a cautious distance from the legal war zone raging between her parents. I could only imagine the confusion and hurt she must have felt. When Nina brought her home that first day, Zoe ran straight into my arms, her little body trembling with soft sobs. My heart shattered anew at her muffled cries. "I missed you so much, Mommy. I was so scared." "Shh, I know, baby," I soothed, fighting my own tears. "I missed you more than you could ever know, but it's okay now. We're going to be okay." She pulled back, her young face still so innocent yet bearing a new heaviness. "Is Daddy ever coming home?" A lump formed in my throat as I studied her deep brown eyes, so much like Evan's. How could I lie, yet also deprive her of hope? "Daddy can't be with us anymore, sweetheart," I managed carefully. "He made some choices that went against what we believe is right." Zoe's brow furrowed in confusion. "Did he do something bad?" "In a way, yes." I sighed, pulling her close again. "But you don't have to worry about any of that now. What matters is you and me and how we move forward from here, okay?" She nodded, seeming to grasp the simplicity of that concept, despite the complexities raging underneath. In that moment, I vowed to preserve her innocence, her trust, in whatever way I could. Over the following weeks, we began to rebuild our little family of two. With Evan's financial settlement, I was able to secure a fresh start, a cozy rental home away from the shattered remnants of our marriage, enroll Zoe in a new school, and realign my career trajectory in marketing communications. Slowly, smiles and warmth began returning to Zoe's youthful exuberance as our new normal solidified, no longer weighed down by that toxic undercurrent of dysfunction surrounding Evan and Marla. The only hiccup came when I received a terse communication from Sienna, Evan's former mistress, the woman he had intended to breed his heir with. "Your pathetic excuse for a husband came crawling back, in case you were wondering," her message read acidly. "But once I got a taste of his true self and that monster-in-law, I wanted no part of that dysfunctional freak show." She included documentation showing the exorbitant settlement she had demanded to preserve her silence and disappear from our lives for good. A final insult to injury, paid from my share of the divorce payout. Rather than anger, I felt only pity for Sienna's sad delusion that she'd been anything more than a dispensable pawn in Evan and Marla's twisted schemes, and I sensed her message held far more impact for them than for me. The ultimate failure and rejection of their disastrous heir-breeding plot. In a strange way, it felt like the last fading embers of that ugliness had finally burnt out completely, freeing me to turn my energy fully toward nurturing and protecting the family I did have, my ethereal bond with Zoe. There were still the occasional flare-ups from Marla's camp, grotesque tantrums lamenting her loss of control and grandchild, but I simply systemized blocking and containing her, preserving peace for Zoe at all costs. A few months after the finalized settlement, I received an awkward, rambling text from Evan out of the blue. "I know I have no right to darken your life any longer. The wreckage left behind is entirely my shame to bear. But I hope one day Zoe will understand that, despite everything, I did love her with all my heart. The words were a hollow echo, a desperate grasp for validation or absolution after his spinelessness shattered our family. I didn't bother responding, focused entirely on my new beginning, because that broken man's sad plea for sympathy couldn't reach me any longer. Not in the sanctuary of tranquility and love I had rebuilt around my beautiful daughter. Not when his vile deeds had finally caught up to him, leaving him utterly alone with his unbearable guilt. The years passed with surprising tranquility as I raised Zoe in our new peaceful life. There were moments of struggle and heartache, of course, but they paled in comparison to the constant toxicity that pervaded my marriage to Evan. As she grew into a brilliant, self-assured young woman, I made sure Zoe understood the basic truths of what tore our family apart, at least enough for her to recognize the inherent brokenness in her father and grandmother's value system. She never voiced resentment toward them, but a sort of detached pity. An intrinsic understanding of how their obsessive pursuit of an heir destroyed any possible bond. "I'm just glad I had you, Mom," she would say with a maturity beyond her years. "You were the only one who really knew what was important, family, not bloodlines." Her words simultaneously filled me with pride and profound sadness for the innocence she was forced to let wither at such a young age. But I took solace in knowing I had insulated her from the brunt of their viciousness. Until the day that seismic postscript arrived, brutally textured with karma's fury. It was a simple certified letter that appeared innocuous at first glance. But the return address, a maximum security prison, quickly turned my blood cold. With hands trembling, I tore it open to find a terse, stark message. "Mrs. Redding, I regret to inform you that your former husband, Evan Redding, has been incarcerated on charges of corporate racketeering, embezzlement, and tax evasion related to his business activities." The legalese continued, but my vision blurred as the full weight landed. Evan was going to prison for upwards of a decade, his career and reputation utterly immolated in the wake of those charges. Just like I had threatened all those years ago with my hidden evidence, a thermonuclear strike I'd hoped would never truly be detonated. Clearly, authorities had dug deeper in the aftermath of our brutal divorce and uncovered the full crater of his financial chicanery. The sick twist of satisfaction I felt soured in an instant, replaced by a mix of stunned dismay and something worse, something deeper. Remorse and empathy I didn't want to feel for that wretched man. Because no matter how unforgivable his actions, no matter how much he deserved punishment, I knew this development would utterly shatter Marla. Her whole world, her whole cancerous obsession for continuing the family empire through a male heir, would finally collapse in on itself with Evan incarcerated. She would be alone, bereft, her manipulative power machinations reduced to ashes at last. I tried to stamp out the small tendril of compassion worming through me, reminding myself of her boundless cruelty, her eagerness to obliterate my own family. Yet it persisted, the ghost of the hopeful young bride I had once been, sickened by the realization that Marla had doomed herself and her deepest desire through her very quest to obtain it. Her worldview had been her undoing. The ramifications, of course, would ripple out in unpredictable waves. What would become of their real estate empire and wealth with Evan behind bars? And more urgently, what about Zoe? I was deep in thought, rereading the letter for any clues, when the front door opened and my now-grown daughter swept in from classes. "Hi, Mom. Did you hear from—" She stopped short, taking in my pale, shaken expression. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" Drawing a steadying breath, I wordlessly handed her the letter. Zoe's eyes rapidly scanned the contents, her brows shooting upward in disbelief. "Oh my God, Dad's in prison?" She looked up at me, the shock and hurt palpable despite our long estrangement from Evan. I moved to pull her into a comforting embrace, stroking her hair just like when she was little. "I know, honey, I know. It's a lot to process." She held me tightly for a long moment, and I could sense her whirling thoughts settling like sediment through cloudy waters. Finally, she pulled back, eyes resolute and voice steady. "This doesn't change anything for us, Mom. His mistakes, his crimes, that's on him. We've built a good life beyond his mistakes and grandmother's madness." Zoe squeezed my hands firmly, her warm smile crackling with that resilient spirit inherited from her mother's DNA. Maybe this can be the end of it all, a fresh start, free from his shadow and her poison for good. I gazed at her with swelling pride and love, overcome by the wise perseverance blazing in her youthful eyes. She was right. As the monolithic shockwave propagated outward, Evan behind bars, Marla's world crumbling, we stood together on solid ground, free and unshaken. Perhaps this was the final cosmic realignment, setting the scales permanently even. Pulling my brave, beautiful daughter close, I felt the manacles of that dark family history begin to shed like snakeskin at last. Evan and Marla had bet everything on lies and power lust, unwittingly burrowing their shared grave. But in their defeat, in their self-ruination, I had conquered. My quiet resilience, my bond of love with Zoe had won the generational war. My only lingering words as their entitled kingdom crumbled to dust were the same ones I had snarled at Marla so many years ago. Don't ever set foot near me or my daughter again, because this time, it would be permanent.
Parents kicked me out after donating kidney to their golden child, now wants me to house them. So, growing up, I always knew my place in the family. My half-brother was the golden child, and I was, well, the extra. You know, the one there to fill in when needed, but not really important otherwise. It wasn't like anyone ever said it out loud, but actions speak louder, right? Every little thing he needed, it was like the world had to stop. If he wanted help with homework, I had to put down whatever I was doing. If he wanted a snack, guess who was making it? Yep, me. It wasn't just small stuff, though. It was my whole life being shaped around what he needed or wanted. Every decision in the house seemed to revolve around him. It was like living in someone else's shadow, except I wasn't even allowed to step into the light for a second. One memory that sticks out is when we were kids. Maybe I was around 10 or so. I had this school project I was really excited about. It was one of those science fair things where you build a volcano or whatever. I spent weeks planning it, making sure everything was perfect. The night before the big day, my brother came down with a cold. Not like anything serious, just the sniffles. But my dad? Oh man, you'd think the world was ending. He canceled everything to take care of him. I begged to go to the fair, but nope. Family comes first, they said. By family, they meant my brother. That was just one example. There were a million others. Every birthday party I had was overshadowed by his needs. Every holiday, every trip, it was always about him. I remember once we were planning a family vacation, something I'd been looking forward to for months. I had saved up my allowance, dreaming about all the cool stuff we'd do. Then, just days before, my brother decided he didn't want to go. Guess what? Trip canceled. No discussion, no compromise, just, we need to make sure he's comfortable. It wasn't like he was this terrible person either. He was just used to being the center of attention. My dad and stepmom made sure of that. They would go on and on about how special he was, how he needed all this extra care. Me? I was just there to pick up the slack. It got to a point where I didn't even bother asking for things. What was the point? If it didn't benefit my brother, it wasn't happening. Now don't get me wrong. I get that sometimes kids need extra help or attention, but this wasn't sometimes. This was every single day. I couldn't even remember a time when I felt like I mattered as much as him. It was like I was the backup plan, the spare in case something went wrong with the main attraction. Even school was affected. I was a decent student, nothing amazing, but I tried. I had dreams of going to college, doing something with my life. But my dad had other plans. Anytime my brother needed help with school, guess who was tutoring him? And if I ever needed help, well, tough luck. Figure it out yourself. There was this one time I got a pretty bad grade on a test. I came home feeling terrible and hoped maybe, just maybe, someone would care. Instead, my dad gave me a lecture about how I needed to work harder. But the second my brother got a C on his report card, full-on intervention, tutors, extra study time, everything, it was infuriating. What made it worse was the constant reminder that family sticks together. That line was drilled into my head from the time I could walk. But what they really meant was, I had to stick with them. They didn't owe me the same. It was all about what I could do for the family, specifically my brother. And then there were the little things, the subtle digs that added up over time. Like how my dad would praise my brother for the smallest achievements, but barely acknowledge anything I did. If my brother cleaned his room, it was a celebration. If I aced a test, a nod maybe. It was those small moments that chipped away at me, made me realize I wasn't ever going to be enough in their eyes. I think what hurt the most was how normalized it all became. I started to believe that maybe I wasn't worth as much. Maybe I wasn't supposed to have my own dreams or goals. Maybe my purpose was just to be there for my brother, to make sure he had everything he needed. It was exhausting. Looking back, I wish I had stood up for myself more. But it's hard when you're a kid, and everyone around you is telling you that this is just how things are. I didn't have the words or the confidence to push back. I just accepted it, swallowed my feelings, and kept going. It wasn't until I got older that I started to see the cracks in the facade. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how messed up it was. I mean, no kid should have to grow up feeling like they're second place in their own family. But by the time I figured that out, the damage was done. I had already spent years putting my own needs on hold, all for the sake of family. But yeah, that was my life. Always in the background, always expected to give and never ask for anything in return. And honestly, it shaped a lot of who I am today. Not in a good way, but I'll get into that later. For now, just know that growing up as the other kid in a family that only had eyes for my brother, it was rough. And it left scars I'm still dealing with. It all started when my half-brother got sick. Not just a regular flu or something minor, but really sick. The kind of sick where doctors start throwing around scary words, and suddenly, it feels like the world is crashing down. I remember the day they told us he needed a kidney transplant. My dad and stepmom were freaking out, pacing around the room, trying to figure out what to do. The doctors explained that dialysis was only a temporary solution and that finding a donor was critical. And that's when all eyes turned to me. I didn't even get a chance to process what was happening before they started talking about testing family members. The doctors mentioned how it's common for siblings to be a match, and before I could even think, my dad was already nodding along like it was a done deal. Michael, you'll get tested, right? My dad said, like it wasn't even a question, like it was just expected. What was I supposed to say? No? Of course, I couldn't say no. It wasn't just the pressure from my dad, it was the whole family thing drilled into my head for years. Family sticks together, right? So I agreed. I mean, what else could I do? The testing process was long and honestly, pretty invasive. Blood tests, tissue matching, all sorts of stuff I didn't fully understand at the time. I was just going through the motions, not really thinking about what it all meant. Then came the day the results came back. And surprise, I was a perfect match. Everyone was relieved. My dad hugged me for what felt like the first time in years. My stepmom cried, thanking me over and over. It was overwhelming. I should have felt good about it, right? Like I was doing this huge, selfless thing for my brother. But deep down, I was terrified. The surgery was scheduled quickly. They didn't want to waste any time. The days leading up to it were a blur of hospital visits, paperwork, and awkward family dinners where no one really knew what to say. My brother was quiet, probably scared too, but he never really said much to me about it. It was like we both knew what needed to be done, so we just went along with it. The day of the surgery came faster than I expected. I remember lying on that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was going to be fine. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to change everything. And it did. Just not in the way I thought. The surgery itself went as planned. They took one of my kidneys and gave it to my brother. The doctor said everything looked good, and both of us were expected to recover well. I spent a few days in the hospital, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, but I was relieved it was over. I thought maybe now things would be different. Maybe I'd earned some sort of respect or appreciation from my family. But no. The moment I got home, reality hit hard. My dad and stepmom were so focused on my brother's recovery that I became invisible again. They barely acknowledged what I'd done. It was all about him, how he was feeling, what he needed. I was left to recover on my own, physically and emotionally drained, without so much as a thank you. One night, about a week after the surgery, I tried bringing it up. I told my dad I was struggling, that I was in pain and needed help. His response? "You'll be fine. Your brother needs us more right now." That sentence stuck with me. It was like a slap in the face. I had just given up a part of myself, literally, and still, it wasn't enough. My needs didn't matter. They never did. The worst part? It wasn't just physical recovery. The emotional toll was brutal. I started to feel like I didn't matter at all, like my only purpose in the family was to be there when they needed something. Once I'd served that purpose, I was discarded. My brother eventually got better. He was back on his feet attending follow-up appointments and getting back to his life. Meanwhile, I was left to pick up the pieces of mine. I tried talking to friends about it, but it's hard to explain the kind of emptiness you feel when your own family treats you like a tool rather than a person. I kept thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made over the years, giving up my time, my dreams, and now a literal piece of my body. And for what? To be cast aside the second I wasn't useful anymore? I wish I could say that was the turning point where I stood up for myself, but it wasn't. I just kept going, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to convince myself that maybe one day they'd see me for more than just the backup. But that day never came. And one day my brother had a very bad day, and I started helping even though I was feeling bad, but instead of getting a bit of support, or even a thank you, I got kicked out. My dad and stepmom decided they needed to focus on my brother's recovery, which apparently didn't include me being around. I still remember that conversation. It wasn't even a conversation, really. My dad just came up to me one day, probably 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital, and said, "You need to find somewhere else to stay." That was it. No explanation beyond, "Your brother needs peace and quiet." It wasn't like I was causing a ruckus. I was still recovering myself, barely able to get out of bed most days, without feeling like I was going to collapse. So I packed up what little I had. I didn't have anywhere to go, no savings, no backup plan. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch. Shout out to Dave, by the way. He really saved my ass back then. But even staying there felt like I was overstaying my welcome after a while. Dave had his own life, and here I was, this half-broken guy trying to piece things together. Finding work was tough. I wasn't in any shape to do much physical labor, and most jobs I could get were demanding on the body. But I had to do something, so I started picking up shifts at a local diner. The pay wasn't great, and the hours were long, but it was something. At least I could contribute to the rent and buy some food. The hardest part, though, wasn't the physical stuff. It was the mental toll. I felt completely abandoned. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what I did wrong. Why wasn't I enough? Why did my dad and stepmom think it was okay to just toss me aside like that? Every now and then, I'd hear about them through the grapevine. Mutual friends, neighbors, random people who still kept in touch. My brother was doing fine, of course. He was back at college, living his life like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I was busting my ass just to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach. On top of that, my health was a mess. The surgery had left me with anemia, and some days, it was hard just to get out of bed. I dragged myself to work, pushed through the shifts, and then collapsed back at Dave's place. There were times I felt like giving up, but I couldn't. I didn't really have that option. No one else was going to pick up the pieces for me. One night, I was walking home from a late shift. It was freezing, and I didn't have a proper jacket. I remember thinking how ironic it was. Here I was, struggling to stay warm and fed, while my family was probably cozy at home, not giving me a second thought. That walk home hit me hard. It made me realize just how alone I really was. I tried reaching out to my dad a few times, hoping maybe he'd come around. I'd text him, letting him know how I was doing, asking if we could talk. But I'd either get ignored or get some short, cold response. "Hope you're doing well," or "busy with your brother?" That was it. It was like I didn't even exist to them anymore. Dave would try to cheer me up, telling me I didn't need them, that I could make it on my own, and I appreciated it, I really did. But it's hard to shake that feeling of being unwanted by your own family. It's like this constant weight on your chest, reminding you that you weren't good enough. One of the worst moments came a few months in. I was at work, trying to stay focused, when I got a call from a mutual friend. They mentioned how my dad and stepmom were throwing a party for my brother, celebrating his recovery and his return to school. I wasn't invited, of course. That hurt. Not that I expected an invite, but hearing about it made everything sting all over again. I went home that night and just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I gave up a part of myself for them, and they couldn't even spare a thought for me. That's when I decided I needed to stop trying to reach out. It was clear they had made their choice and I wasn't part of it. The next few months were a blur of work and exhaustion. I kept pushing forward, trying to build something for myself. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of nights I barely made it through. But slowly, I started to accept that I was on my own. Looking back, I think those months were some of the toughest of my life. I felt like I was constantly fighting just to keep my head above water, and the people who should have been there for me were nowhere to be found. It was a harsh lesson, but one I needed to learn. Struggling alone wasn't what I wanted, but it taught me a lot about resilience. I learned that I couldn't rely on anyone else, that if I wanted a better life, I had to make it happen myself. And while it was a painful process, it also made me stronger. It had been years since I heard from my dad. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to hear from him ever again. After everything that happened, getting kicked out, being left to fend for myself, I figured we were done. But then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed, and there it was. A message from my dad. "Hey, can we talk? It's important." At first I thought it might be a mistake. Maybe he meant to text someone else. I mean, why would he want to talk now? But curiosity got the better of me and I replied, "Sure, what's up?" He responded quickly, asking if we could meet in person. That was a bit of a shock. I hadn't seen him since the day he told me to pack my stuff and leave. My gut was telling me not to go, but something in me needed to know what he wanted. We agreed to meet at a small cafe not far from where I worked. I got there a bit early, nerves kicking in. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he apologize? Would he try to guilt trip me into something? My mind was racing with all the possibilities. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, more tired. It was like life had taken a toll on him. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, there was this awkward silence. Neither of us knew how to start. Finally, he spoke. I've been thinking a lot about things. About you. That caught me off guard. I wasn't used to him talking about me, at least not in a way that suggested he cared. I know I haven't been there for you, he continued, but things have been hard, and I need your help. There it was. The real reason for the meeting. I could feel my guard going up. I knew better than to let my guard down too quickly. What kind of help? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He sighed, looking down at the table. I'm in a bit of a situation. We're struggling to keep up with the mortgage. My health's not great, and I can't work like I used to. We've got debts piling up, and we need a place to stay. I sat there, processing what he was saying. After everything they put me through, after tossing me aside like I was nothing, now he was asking for my help? It felt surreal. You want to move in with me? I asked, trying to wrap my head around it. He nodded. Just for a little while, until we can get back on our feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those years of struggling alone, and now he wanted to come back into my life because he needed something from me. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Why now? I finally asked. Why come to me after all this time? He hesitated, then said, We tried asking your brother, but his fiancée wasn't on board. We didn't have anywhere else to turn. That hit me like a punch to the gut. So, I was the last resort. Not the first choice, not even the second. Just the backup plan, like always. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the situation. Part of me wanted to tell him exactly where he could go, but another part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He looked desperate, and despite everything, there was still that tiny sliver of hope in me that maybe, just maybe, this could be a chance to mend things. But then I remembered all the nights I spent struggling alone, all the times I reached out, hoping for some acknowledgement, some support, and got nothing in return. I couldn't just forget that. I don't know, Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You kicked me out when I needed you the most. Now you're asking me to take you in? It's a lot to process. He nodded like he understood. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, but I'm trying to make things right. I'm asking for a chance. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But trust isn't something that just magically appears. It has to be earned, and he had a lot of ground to cover. I'll think about it, I finally said, but I need time. He nodded again, looking a little relieved. That's all I'm asking for. We sat there for a few more minutes, talking about nothing in particular. It was awkward, like two strangers trying to find some common ground. When we finally parted ways, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was angry, part of me was sad, and part of me was just confused. I spent the next few days thinking about that conversation. I replayed it over and over in my head, trying to figure out what to do. On one hand, he was my dad, and a part of me still wanted to help. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore all the pain he'd caused me. In the end, I knew I had a tough decision to make, and whatever I chose, it wasn't going to be easy. After our cafe meeting, I thought I'd have some time to breathe and think things through. But nope, my dad didn't give me much of a break. A couple of days later, my phone started blowing up with texts. At first, it was just simple messages like, Have you thought about what we talked about? Or, We really need your help. I ignored them, hoping he'd back off, but that wasn't happening. The next day, he called. I let it go to voicemail because honestly, I wasn't ready for another conversation. But then I listened to the message, and it was him, sounding all serious. Michael, it's your dad. I know you're busy, but this is important. Please call me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't at least hear him out, he'd just keep pushing. So I called him back, and right away, I knew this wasn't going to be a quick chat. Michael, he said, I didn't want to bother you, but I've been thinking about our last conversation. I need to explain a few things. Here we go, I thought. Okay, I'm listening. He started with the whole family speech. You know the one, how family sticks together, how we're supposed to help each other in tough times. It was the same stuff I'd heard my whole life, but now it felt different, like he was using it as a weapon. Your mom would have wanted you to help, he said, throwing that in there like a low blow. She believed in family and taking care of each other. I know she'd be proud of you for stepping up. That hit hard. My mom had passed away when I was younger, and bringing her into this felt like a cheap shot. He knew I loved her, and he was using that to guilt me. I stayed quiet, trying to process what he was saying without letting it get to me. I know I wasn't perfect, he continued. I made mistakes, but we're family, Michael. And family forgives. Family helps each other. I could feel the pressure building. He was laying it on thick, and I knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't about making amends or fixing our relationship. It was about getting what he wanted, me to take them in and fix their mess. Dad, I get what you're saying, I finally said. But you have to understand, this isn't easy for me. You can't just expect me to forget everything and pretend like it's all okay. He sighed, like he was disappointed in my response. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to put the past behind us and focus on what's important now. Then he dropped another bomb. Your brother won't do it. He's got his own life, his own problems. But you've always been the responsible one. You've always been the one we could count on. There it was, the ultimate guilt trip. My brother, the golden child, was off the hook because he had his own life, but I was expected to pick up the pieces because I was the responsible one. It was the same story, just a different chapter. Dad, I've been responsible my whole life, I said, my voice shaking a little. I've sacrificed so much already. I gave up a part of myself for this family, and what did I get in return? I got kicked out. I know, he said, his voice softening. And I'm sorry for that. I really am. But we're in a tough spot, Michael. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious. I wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair it was to put this on me. But instead I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I need time to think, I said, hoping it would buy me some space. Take your time, he said, but I could hear the urgency in his voice. Just remember what your mom would have wanted. That line stuck with me long after the call ended. I couldn't believe he had used my mom's memory to guilt me into helping. It was like he knew exactly where to hit to make me feel the worst. And the worst part? It was working. I was torn between wanting to stand my ground and not wanting to let my mom down, even if she wasn't here to see it. Over the next few days, I replayed the conversation in my head over and over. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened. The guilt was eating away at me, making it hard to focus on anything else. I knew what he was doing, but it didn't make it any easier to ignore. I talked to a few close friends about it, trying to get their perspective. They all said the same thing. You don't owe him anything. After everything he put you through, he's the one who should be apologizing, not asking for favors. They were right, of course. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things. Every time I thought about saying no, that little voice in my head would remind me of what my dad said about my mom. It was like a tug of war between my head and my heart. In the end, I knew I had to make a decision. But whatever I chose, I knew there'd be no going back. A few days after our last call, my dad reached out again. This time, he wasn't just texting or leaving voicemails. He showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting him, so when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I was caught off guard. He looked worse than before. Tired, worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. Michael, we need to talk, he said, his voice shaky. I hesitated for a second, but stepped aside and let him in. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us heavy. I could tell this wasn't going to be a casual chat. I know I've been pushing you, he started, his hands fidgeting in his lap. And I'm sorry for that, but things have gotten worse. We're running out of options. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. I wanted to hear what he had to say, even though I already had a good idea of where this was going. We've tried everything, he continued. We've sold what we could, cut back on expenses, but it's not enough. We're going to lose the house. Hearing him say that was tough. As much as I had distanced myself from them, it still hurt to think of my dad losing the place we called home for so many years. But I couldn't ignore everything that had happened. It wasn't as simple as just opening my door and letting them in. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he went on. And you're right. We didn't treat you the way we should have. I didn't treat you the way I should have. That caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting an apology, especially not one that seemed so genuine. I let you down, he said, his voice cracking. I was so focused on your brother that I forgot about you, and I've regretted it every day since. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe him, to accept the apology and move forward. But another part of me was still holding on to all the pain and resentment. I'm sorry, he repeated, his eyes welling up with tears. I know I can't change the past, but I'm asking for your help now because we have nowhere else to turn. Then, something I never expected happened. My dad broke down, full on tears, sobbing into his hands. I'd never seen him like that before. He was always the strong, stoic type, the guy who kept his emotions in check. Seeing him like this was jarring. I don't know what else to do, he said through the tears. I've always tried to be strong, to hold everything together, but I can't do it anymore. I need help, Michael. I need your help. It was hard to watch. This man, who I had always seen as unshakable, was falling apart right in front of me. It stirred something inside me, this mix of sadness, anger, and a deep, aching sympathy. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my own voice shaky. This, this is a lot. I know, he said, wiping his face. And I know I have no right to ask after everything, but I'm desperate. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. I could feel the conflict tearing me apart inside. On one hand, he was my dad, and seeing him like this was breaking my heart. But on the other hand, I couldn't just forget all the times he had let me down. I need to think about this, I finally said, breaking the silence. I can't give you an answer right now. He nodded, his eyes still red from crying. I understand, just please don't take too long. We don't have much time. After he left, I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying everything in my head. Seeing my dad like that, so vulnerable, had shaken me. It was like all the walls I had built around myself were starting to crumble. But no matter how much I wanted to help, I couldn't ignore the past. I couldn't just pretend that everything was okay. This wasn't just about finding a place for them to stay. It was about years of pain and neglect that couldn't be swept under the rug. I knew I had a decision to make, and whatever I chose, it would change everything. The days following my dad's breakdown were some of the hardest I've ever had. Every time I tried to focus on work or anything else, my mind would drift back to that moment. Seeing him cry, hearing the desperation in his voice, it was all on repeat in my head. I knew I couldn't avoid making a decision forever, but that didn't make it any easier. I thought about all the times I'd been there for them, all the sacrifices I'd made, giving up my kidney, getting kicked out, struggling on my own while they focused on my brother. Every memory felt like a punch to the gut. How could they expect me to just forget all that? One night, as I was lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about something my dad had said. We have nowhere else to turn. The words kept bouncing around in my head. A part of me felt guilty, like maybe I was being too harsh. But then, another part of me reminded me of all the nights I spent alone, fighting to survive while they didn't seem to care. I decided I needed to talk to him again, face to face. Avoiding him wasn't going to solve anything, and I had to get everything off my chest. So I called him up and asked if he could meet me at the same cafe. He agreed, sounding relieved, like he thought this might be the turning point. When I got there, he was already waiting. He looked tired, probably hadn't slept much since our last meeting. I sat down, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The weight of what was about to be discussed hung heavy in the air. Dad, I started, I've been thinking a lot about everything. He nodded, waiting for me to continue. I know you're in a tough spot, and I get why you're asking for my help, I said, but I need you to understand where I'm coming from. His eyes met mine, and I could see the worry in them. I'm listening, he said quietly. I took a deep breath. You made a lot of choices that hurt me. When I needed you the most, you weren't there. You chose them over me, every single time. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm sorry for that. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I continued, but you have to understand why this is so hard for me. I've spent years trying to move past everything, trying to build a life for myself despite everything that happened. And now you're asking me to bring all that back into my life. I didn't know what else to do, he admitted. I've been trying to fix things, but it's not easy. I get that, I said. But you have to understand that it's not easy for me either. I've been through hell and back, and it's taken everything I have to get to where I am now. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us lost in our thoughts. I don't want to say no, I finally said, but I have to be honest with you, I can't do this. I can't let you and her move in with me. He looked like he'd been hit with a ton of bricks. Michael, please, he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. I need to protect myself, I said firmly. I've spent too much of my life putting everyone else first, sacrificing my own well-being for others. I can't keep doing that. But we're family, he said, his voice breaking. Isn't that supposed to mean something? It does, I said. But family isn't just about what you're born into. It's about how you treat each other. And for too long, I felt like I wasn't really a part of this family. He lowered his head, clearly struggling to process what I was saying. I never meant to make you feel that way, he whispered. I know, I said. But intention doesn't erase the impact. I've carried the weight of those choices for years, and I can't carry it anymore. He nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. I don't know what we're going to do, he admitted, but I understand where you're coming from. I hope you can figure something out, I said. I really do. But I can't be the solution this time. We sat there for a while longer, not saying much. There wasn't much else to say. The decision had been made, and now we both had to live with it. When we finally got up to leave, he gave me a long, heavy look. Thank you for being honest, he said. I wish things were different. Me too, I replied. And with that, we went our separate ways. Walking away from that conversation, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering guilt. But deep down, I knew I had made the right choice. It wasn't easy, but sometimes doing what's right for yourself means making the hardest decisions.